More. So welcome to session 25 of Classic Metal class. We're happy to see some old hands, frequent flyers here because we've got a very interesting topic to dig into today. We've looked at a lot of numbers, a lot of different eras and regions in music history, but we've never gone to the Far East. So session one, we kicked off talking about early heavy metal. Session two is specifically about Black Sabbath and the Deep Purple Nexus, so British heavy metal. We kept on with the British theme in session five with mid to late 1970s British metal, and then session seven, new wave of British heavy metal, which we revisited just recently with Ken, who's here, doing a sort of experiential thing about that. And we've strayed out of Britain. We talked about American metal a good bit. Session eight was on American metal in the 70s, and then we looked at the LA scene in the 80s, and we even got to German metal, but there's a lot for us to still go through in this era of the 70s and 80s. So it was about time that we actually got to Japanese metal, and for two really good reasons. One is that, there's a real interesting, let's call it, movement within Japan that goes all the way back to the beginnings of heavy metal and continues on. So it's rich and diverse. But, I think everybody's heard that funny expression, big in Japan, right? A band could be unknown over here, but it's big in Japan. And for a lot of bands, Japan was a pretty important source of income. And there's this really interesting cross fertilization that's going on. So when Scott and I were talking about this session, here's what I'll say. I'm going to give a recap, and then Scott, you tell me if I've left anything out about what we were envisioning. So we're going to discuss the 70s as a time when heavy metal is developing both in the West and in Japan, and there's sort of cross connections, and it's emerging out of various music scenes that are similar in some respects, hard and heavy rock with prog playing a role and blues playing a role. And then we wanted to talk about how the scene kind of widens out and starts getting all these bands that are self-consciously heavy metal. And, we're going to talk about Japan as a place that in some respect, it didn't keep metal alive because it wasn't the only place that metal was going on. But I mean, economically, I think that Japan provided a set of fans and venues where people could actually make a lot of money, and part of that has to do with Japanese culture. And when we would go and look at import records, they would largely be from Japan if we were lucky enough to get our hands on them.
Right.
So we're going to discuss some of the bands. This is not going to, touch on every single band. I did put together a discography of stuff that we've been listening to. That's, good for getting your feet wet if you don't have a lot of background in this. And we want to discuss what's distinctively Japanese to some degree about this whole scene. And, as I was mentioning before, for me and Scott, as opposed to say like Ken, who was over in Britain during the new wave of British heavy metal, growing up here in the United States, you had a pretty limited range of stuff unless you lived in LA or New York City. And getting to go to the record store and finding the import section where you'd find these kind of cool things, or you'd see, that things were recorded in Japan, like made in Japan is a prime example of a record. Japan was, sort of this exotic place for us where somehow they were super into heavy metal, but we didn't know much about it. And now with the age of the internet, you can, read interviews and find out all sorts of cool stuff about what was going on. We get exposure to bands that we couldn't have encountered back then. You know, Loudness is kind of a prime example of a band that we actually could hear, right? Because they had a video on MTV, Crazy Nights, and they were touring around. But for the most part, a lot of this stuff was just not on our radar. And so what have I left out, Scott? What we were going to talk about? Any other things?
I mean, well, we were going to talk. I think one of the big things was going to be like culturally,
Hmm.
this is so big. You know, even now, I mean, not to jump ahead or anything, I had a friend that played guitar with Paul Gilbert, you know, from Racer X and you
Yeah.
know, Mr. Big. Now, even Racer X and Mr. Big play smaller venues, and Paul Gilbert, if he went on tour, he'd play like a club. You know, even though everybody knows him, he'd probably draw like 60 people. But my friend said when I went out, Paul Gilbert was selling out 20,000 seat arenas. And I said, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they really love the shred guitar. Now that's where, you know, so it's shred metal is what a lot of them get into, like the intense shred metal. But I couldn't believe that somebody that it, like you said, in our backyard, if he were to come to Boston, um, he would he would do maybe about the same as some local band. But you go to Japan where it's a whole, you're right, it's a whole especially Japan.
Yeah.
Japan is like the metal.
I mean, another place that you can say really supports metal in that way is South America.
Right.
If you have a show, you know there are shows that some of the big bands are doing where there's over 100,000 people. So
Oh, Rock and
that's
Rio, right?
yeah,
The
yeah,
that was a pretty intense watch, like the
yeah.
Iron Maiden one. It was
I
overwhelming.
will I will say something kind of funny. And before that though, let's so Ken says that his experience was the same in the UK. Japanese imports were almost unheard of in the late 70s, early 80s. Even things like Judas Priest Unleashed in the East were highly unusual at the time. Now, the thing that I was going to bring up, and it takes us a little bit off topic, but talking about like really big venues, so Metallica was posting recently in social media about this show that they had done in it was either Leningrad or Moscow, and it was huge. Like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people came, and they wrote it as if they had been the headliners or they were the main attraction, and they were not. It was early enough in Metallica's career where they were, you know how you've got like the lists of bands and it starts out with like the big headliner in giant print, and then as you go down the band logos get smaller and smaller. They were about like, halfway down, I think. Um, so, sometimes it's you put together a bunch of bands and you get a huge crowd and reaction. But, this is something we'll get to the Japanese culture thing
Yeah.
in just a bit. So, 1970s, right? Heavy metal, we can say, is born essentially in 1970. And people, if there's one band that people will associate with it, it's Black Sabbath. Although, we've talked about this before, there's other bands that are playing things that are recognizably heavy metal and will be influential. Some people want to count Led Zeppelin, or at least some of what they do is metal. We've got Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, UFO. Um, and we've got the Flower Travellin Band in Japan. And their very first album, um, on Anywhere, has a cover of Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath on it. And so, this is 1970. This is not like a time when music is just traveling immediately. These guys got their hands on an album that had been very recently released, liked it so much they were like, we need to cover this song. Now, the rest of the album, it's not really heavy metal, but the first Japanese heavy metal album is their next one, Satori, which is just a bunch of tracks, each titled Satori 1, Satori 2, Satori 3. And, and it's not heavy metal in the like 1980s sense where you've got the blazing guitars and distortion and stuff like that. It's heavy stuff like what Sabbath is doing, or like what Deep Purple is doing, or Sir Lord Baltimore. And it's kind of cool to see that. So that means that heavy metal in Japan goes back as far as that time. And when you listen to them, you can say, okay, definitely not heavy metal as we understood it in the 80s. But it's consistent. It's if you didn't know who's playing it, you'd be like, yeah, that's probably coming from England around this time, right? What's your impression of that album, Scott?
Well, you know, I would say you're right about not really. I mean, it's more drawing from like kind of what Zeppelin did, the bluesy kind of
Yeah,
um those kind of licks. But I'm to be honest, before we started this, I had no idea that something from Japan was starting that soon. And you're right. I don't know how albums got over there or if you were really special, like you could get hold of these albums. But obviously they were influenced by Sabbath,
yeah,
you know,
very much
and
so.
and what's odd is this is before because this is early on, did Sabbath tour over there or did like
Ooh,
was anybody over there to kind of say, for them to be influenced or just did some kid get a hold
yeah.
of the record?
So Sabbath doesn't tour Japan until I think 1980, as
Right.
opposed to a lot of these other bands that we're going to see in the 70s, and we'll talk about in just a moment, that are there. So like people can go to their shows and say, "Holy crap, I want to do this."
Well, that's
Um,
right. That's what I mean. Like
yeah,
why
yeah.
uh it's
I mean, it must have been available in some record stores somewhere.
yeah, I
And
mean, like you just said it and I will keep saying it. I mean, we had a Tower Records here and if anybody had the Japanese imports, it was them, you
okay,
know.
yeah,
So we
yeah,
used to go there and like go through this they would have the international section. We grab anything that said Japan release only. Um and we should talk about why there was a Japan release only.
yeah. We'll come to that in a bit. So
Yeah.
Mark says I would classify the album Satori as psychedelic heavy blues, and I think there's a
Mhm.
continuum there. I mean, when we're talking about early heavy metal, so those three terms I think are quite important. A lot of what we call proto metal is the stuff that we call psychedelic. So if you think about Britain, is Cream heavy metal? Well, not really, but it's metallic, right? And it's because it's blues based. It is psychedelic. There's that fuzz sound to things,
Yeah.
and there's this emphasis on heavy. That is playing out there. And there's other Japanese bands that are around at the time that people who write about this don't consider metal. They're like, this could be proto metal, but it's more prog, it's more blues, it's more
Right.
psychedelic. And I think you can say the same thing about heavy metal in the States and Britain. The idea that people would consider Queen a heavy metal act in the 70s and lump it in there, it's kind of a weird idea to us in the present, right? But if you think about the way sounds were organized and who's buying albums and going on tours, or Grand Funk Railroad, are they a heavy metal act? I don't think
No,
so,
I
but
think they're a
people were
rock and roll
willing.
band.
Yeah, yeah.
And
But
the
people
most
were willing to kind of extend the label because nobody really knew what it meant.
and I don't know, I've probably said this on the show before. The one of the most interesting ones that we always kind of think about, everybody's called Blue Oyster Cult one of the early heavy
Right.
metal
Yeah,
bands.
yeah.
And I talked to Buck Dharma and I said, so did you guys you were at the beginning of heavy metal, 1970? He goes, everybody thinks we're heavy metal. No, we came from Haight-Ashbury, like Jefferson Airplane was our influence and the Dead. And he goes, if I could join any band, it would be the Dead. And I'm thinking, are you kidding? Like some of the stuff is actually really heavy that you
Yeah.
play.
Yeah, yeah.
And but he would say we're not a heavy metal band at all. So this is interesting about, what people consider to be, I mean, that's where I got it wrong. I would say that was a 70s metal band.
Yeah. Well, I think you can argue that Flower Traveling Band is early heavy metal because, it's this loosey-goosey classification that we have. And interestingly, they didn't know that their music was catching on because they were touring around in the US and Canada, and communications weren't that good at the time, but they end up being quite influential. And there's a number of other Japanese bands, as we just mentioned, who are not heavy metal, but they're really heavy in sound. And sometimes they'll have a song or two that could be considered metal, just like we have, bands in the US and even Germany and Britain doing that. So there's a band that is called Blues Creation. So that tells you what they're about. And they have a song, they have an album called Demon and 11 Children, 1971. It's pretty heavy, it's plodding. Then there's this fried egg that has the Dr. Siegel's fried egg shooting machine, and it's mostly prog stuff, right? And there's some kind of doom metal like tracks, so they're not a metal band, but there's a scene kind of forming, and then going to like the tours. So Deep Purple toured in Japan, as we know from their albums that they have. UFO toured in Japan and brought out an album live. I mean, you can't get any more unoriginal than that. Just live, right? But it's from Japan. Deep Purple's album, of course, is made in Japan,
Yep.
which will influence a lot of other ones. But Uriah Heep toured there in the early 70s as well. And you can see some influence from that on some of the Japanese bands that come later. Sabbath was supposed to tour in 72. It was like supposed to be the end of their tour. And I'm not sure why they canceled it. I think they had 3 or 4 dates, but they did cancel it. And so they didn't get over there until I think 1980 with Ronnie James Dio. And then in the early 70s, we have a couple important other things happening. There's a band called Murasaki, which means purple. And Deep Purple is their sort of influencers. And they're really heavy when they play live and they cover Highway Star. So I think cover songs kind of tell you something about this. And
Yeah.
they play at these important music festivals like Rock Day 75. Another band that is going to become the nucleus for probably the best known classic heavy metal band in Japan, Loudness, is called Lazy. And they're formed originally to be uh, I'm mixing them up with a different band. Sorry. Lazy forms and they're inspired by Deep Purple song as well. Um, so you got this kind of mix going on, but no movement as such, right? Ken says Flowers' influence was very significant. If I remember correctly, their vocalist later had a solo project that was a huge stylistic influence on early doom metal. Yeah, and there's a couple interesting solo projects with these guys. And then once we get into the 70s, right? The mid 70s, we start seeing bands forming that are more metal, not completely metal, at least some of them. So we get this band Bow Wow, which will later on become Vow Wow when they opportunistically shift much more towards metal, realizing that there's money to be made in that. And so this guy who's a record producer wants to create a Japanese version of like the Monkees or the Bay City Rollers, a band that the girls are going to go wild about. And if you listen to some of their early stuff, there is this sense of like, this is marketed music, and they're always kind of pushing against it as well. And they've got some songs that could be metal. Murasaki has an album, self-titled album in 76 that's pretty heavy. There's a song Devil Woman on it that people consider to be early Japanese metal. And then one of the sort of standouts that went nowhere but I really recommend is Ginbae. They have a debut album, 1976, and if you were to listen to it and close your eyes, this stuff could be Black Sabbath. It's really heavy, slow, doomy. The riffs are just monstrous. I think that's metal. We also have a really interesting debut. It's not even a debut album, it's an EP. And you can find it out there online, but you can't find the whole EP. You can only find particular songs from it. And it's more of a Deep Purple, Uriah Heep kind of thing with the big organs, but guitars and all that. And they're called Sansuikan, and they put out a 4-song demo tape. One of the songs, and I'm blanking on the name, it has something to do with the Hydra, is about like 15 minutes long. So, you know, there's only 4 songs, but you get a lot with them. And they're using the organ, but they're clearly in the metal genre. It's riff driven. There's like, on their song 100,000 volt, which is going to be, later on played by another. Um, Beautiful guitar solo, followed by an organ solo, followed by a guitar solo. That's like Deep Purple or Uriah Heep on their heavier stuff, right? John Lord uses his organ very similar to a guitar. It's similar to what you hear on Rainbow too, in their early first 3 albums. They are going to merge with this band Scheherazade and become Novella. And then some of the guys are going to split off and they're going to form the band Action, which is a bona fide 1980s metal band. There's one other band that I think is really important to listen to. And this is something where you can say, this is heavy metal. So there's this band Nokemono, and they're formed in 77. They win, and this is part of the Japanese culture stuff that's, I think, important too, but we also see this in America and in Britain as well. Battles of the bands or contests, right? Doesn't really happen anymore, but that used to be a big thing. So there's this Midland 78 rock contest, and bands could like sign up and compete, and it's sponsored by Yamaha, so it's got some money behind it, and they play there and they win the contest, and that gets them a slot opening up for Judas Priest, right? So that's how you can tell you're kind of making it, right? And they get invited back, and then they release this album From the Black World. And this is a heavy metal album. So this is 1979, Um, they're clearly influenced by Judas Priest, also by the Scorpions, and then they disband. So, where would they have gone after that? We don't really know. So there's a lot of stuff that's cool going on in there. And, if we want to think about, so there's this Japanese context, but there's also Western bands that are coming. We've got new bands that are touring. Deep Purple comes back. Kiss tours, right? Aerosmith, Van Halen actually makes it over there. Believe it or not, Raven gets over there as well. And we've already talked about Judas Priest, but this is where Unleashed in the East comes from. Deep Purple has a couple albums that are released a little bit later because they break up, in 76. But this time around, Live in Tokyo comes out in 77. The last concert in Japan, 77. It actually happened in 75. And then Ian Gillan has his own solo band because, he'd been out of Purple, I think, since what, 73? Does that sound right, Scott?
Yeah, because Coverdale's 74, 75, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So he tours with his band, which is a great metal band, by the way. And they have a Live at the Budokan album. Rainbow Tours on stage is recorded partly in Germany, partly in Japan. And then, of course, there's the Scorpions Tokyo tapes, right? So you've got all these pretty big acts touring around in Japan, making money, getting Japanese fans, inspiring bands, sometimes bringing them on to tour with them. And so I think you can talk about like maybe a fermentation going on. And so Mark had said a little bit earlier, this is going to be a sweeping claim, but it seems to me Japan is a different consumer culture than the UK or US, though in some way the consumer objects are similar across cultures. The way Japan goes about consuming it is in a way more sophisticated than the West. Metal bands seem to have found a niche in that. And I think that's right. There is and this is part of what allows bands to have a more lasting, rabid fan base that is going to support them with money and you know showing up for tours, because I mean, actually, let me ask you this, guy, and I don't want you to draw on any painful experiences of your own unless you want to, but so you show up at a venue and if you're somebody who's been touring around and there's hardly anyone there, now you could be like, oh, I'm a professional. I play to a group of five just as I would 500 or 5,000, but it's got to kind of suck, right? When you don't get an audience for your show.
Especially in this genre where the intensity of the room drives the band,
Yeah.
because when you're rehearsing heavy metal, you're playing for an imaginary audience. And if you ever seen like rehearsal tapes of any of the metal bands, they're at some sound stage somewhere, but they're like jumping around stage and they're not just, playing this stuff. So, I mean, you got to imagine five people there and you're used to screaming how are you doing? Wherever, um,
Yeah.
and so
I was just thinking of Spinal Tap, that scene where they've got like a giant stage and there's like three people in the audience.
and then they did the jazz fusion exploration.
Right. Yeah.
um, yeah, especially in that genre, but people, I know people that are, I'm not going out there. Forget it,
Yeah.
and other people that will give it their all anyways because they're doing their job. Um, you're supposed like five people paid to come see you,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I've,
You
I've
know,
I've been
so
there.
so coming back to like the consumer culture thing, something that a lot of people have pointed out, and I've seen this when, I had like a Japanese roommate for a while when I was in college, and we had this exchange program, and all these people came in, and it was kind of amazing to see the interest in American consumer culture that they had. So post World War II, once prosperity hits Japan, there's this tendency to like make your hobbies or interests or fandom or collecting not your absolute identity, but really central to your identity. And it's kind of tolerated. Like, well, that person's into this and that person's into this. And it interfaces nicely with consumer culture. So I'll give you an example from my experience. There were two things that really struck me, and this is the mid 90s with Japanese students. They had catalogs for Levi's jeans products. And, I'd heard of 501, which I wore, and I think there were a couple other 50s that we could get. I didn't realize that there's 501, 502, 503, 504. There's like a plethora of numbers, and you can't get them here in the States unless you're like in a really fancy place, right? For the us schmucks in the Midwest, you got what you got at the department store.
Right.
They were generally available over there, and people would be like, "Oh, you're wearing that jean. Oh, that's pretty cool." And the other thing that was just extraordinary. So I had a Zippo lighter because I was a smoker at the time. And they were very interested in like looking at it. And then they looked at the bottom of it and they're like, "Oh yeah, this one's not valuable at all." And I was like, "Well, why would it be?" You know?
Yeah,
And they're
right.
like, "Well, you got to understand that Zippo has like all these different tiers of lighters, and some are very old, and some are fancier." And one of them got his out, and he's like, "Check out my lighter." And I was like, "Well, it looks pretty similar to mine." And then he's like, "No, this feature, this feature, this feature." And I was like, well, why are you carrying it around if it's a collector's item? And he said, well, you want to enjoy your collector's items. It's not like nerds who have the Star Wars figures that stay
Right.
in the box and you never use. And actually, I mean, we could talk about this with guitars, Scott, right? People collect them and all that. And this is part of the Japanese, let's call it fan collector culture in a way that I mean, Americans maybe don't relate to this as much, or Europeans don't relate to it quite in the same way. I mean, guitars. I remember you talking years ago about the problem with collectors pricing guitars out for working musicians, back when that was kind of an issue.
Well, it's
Um,
it's it's still an issue, but it's interesting because it's people from Japan that will show up in business suits and with a lot of money.
and
And
purchase
we're talking,
guitars.
yeah, and a 1959 Gibson Les Paul goes for about $250,000.
Wow.
So they'll buy out that, and then they put them in some kind of uh, you know, uh,
Display
controlled
case or
environment,
okay.
like vault or something. So the instruments stay okay, but that's what they're investing in because
Yeah.
that's like buying bonds or something. And that was the thing is, you know, musicians were frustrated because we could be playing them, but you know, they'll get that much, so they'll sell for that much.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of different with albums, right? Because so there's this whole Japanese market pressing albums for Japan with like Japanese labeling and stuff like that, which makes sense. Not everybody speaks English over
Mhm.
there. But what made them attractive to a lot of Western fans was you get like bonus tracks on them that wouldn't just be like a live performance. This is an actual track that's not available here. And so there's often like there's specific Japanese record companies, and then there's Japanese record subsidiaries of American or European or British companies where they're connected together in some way. But the same album could be, so like Deep Purple could produce an album, all of us would have more or less the same album, but it would be different in Japan, you
And
know.
even the order of the songs, if you've ever noticed,
Right, right, yeah,
times would be different. Like, do you have the one that starts with this one or I mean, even like the UK versus the US versions sometimes,
yeah,
the order of the songs are different on some of the albums. It's like, oh no, the first track of that album is this. Well, no, it's this. And see, but mine doesn't have that, which is
yeah,
kind of interesting.
yeah. And you see something in the 80s going the other way, where Japanese bands will make an album and they're singing in Japanese on the album, and then they'll do an English version of those same songs. And some of them are, you wouldn't be able to tell that they've got a Japanese accent. Some of them are, as bad with the English as Klaus Meine is from
Right.
German to English or Udo, right? And everything in between. But it's the same sort of phenomenon of marketing to a different audience. But with a Japanese audience, you can count on them buying all this stuff and selling out seats. And I think that maybe part of that. So you've got this collector's culture, we'll call it. But I think another really important factor, which makes Japan more similar to, say, Great Britain during, like, say, the new wave of British heavy metal, is that you've got good public transportation, which is not the case here in the United States.
Right.
And venues and cities are much closer together. So a band can tour, you can tour Japan much the same way as you would tour Great Britain, all the way up to like, the North or even Scotland and back down again. Whereas if you're doing an American tour, especially if it's got a Canadian component, that's a huge undertaking. So once you actually are in Japan, you can get around pretty easily. And that's not just important for the bands, that's super important for the fans. So if you live in one place and you want to hear a band that's, 100 miles north in another city, you can get on the train, whereas can we do stuff like that? I
Right.
mean, maybe in the Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor, but not in the rest of the United States. If we want to go down and see a show in Chicago and we just live here in Milwaukee, yes, we can take a bus, and we better hope that bus drops us off relatively close to where we need to be. And there is a train that runs, I think, 4 times a day, an Amtrak, which is very expensive.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're driving, And so I think that's part of, when you have something like that, like what we were talking about with Ken last time, you get this whole ecosystem of smaller clubs and venues that can support the bands that are coming up. And without that, it's harder to foster a heavy metal culture, I think.
That's definitely true. The um transportation system it was an interesting one that you brought up that I didn't think about. The ease of going, taking away that obstacle for saying, I'm not going to go to that because
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important aspect, isn't it? Because when people are, I mean, this is a broader thing than just heavy metal, but when people are making decisions, oftentimes the prioritizations, should I do this or do this, depends on pretty small factors. And so a lot of people are like, heavy metal's going to be fine, or pick whatever else. People are just going to keep buying things and going to concerts. Well, to take it into the present, if getting a ticket involves a surcharge of about 25 to 50%, a lot of people are like, screw it, I'm not going. And then that affects the capacity for musicians to make money,
Mhm.
being able to get to places, do we want to do, I mean, this will make us sound really lazy, but Andy and I, as people in our 50s, if a band isn't playing here in Milwaukee or nearby, we're probably not going to see them. We
Right.
look at some of the tours that are coming through and they're in Chicago and we're like, do we want to go do that again? And as old people, we're often like, I don't think so. Not this time around. Hope they tour again.
Yeah, right. Well, same in
So,
Boston. A lot of bands oddly don't come to Boston, and
hmm.
there's theories about that, but then people will drive to New York to see the band, which is about from Boston is about 3.5, 4 hour drive.
And then you got to go into the city.
Then you got to go into the city. They'll drive north, a few hours to New Hampshire, or you know, people, some people, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if I do that, unless I had other things in the city. But
Yeah.
if they don't come to Boston, it's kind of tough. I mean, maybe when I was younger, like you said.
Yeah. So, going on with like the Japanese context, that's kind of unique. We've got the transportation system, the fandom, you've got these music festivals and battles of bands being put on. And it's kind of a cool feature that, reading about this, obviously not experiencing it myself. Um, there's an interesting bifurcation that a lot of people have talked about where, in general, you can say that the Japanese culture tends to emphasize fitting in, being orderly, not sticking out or stuff like that. And you say, well, that's not great for heavy metal, where there's this rebelliousness to it. And so people, musicians have talked about this. There'd be a nice orderly line outside of the stadium or the club. And then once they got into the club, it's pandemonium. People are just, thrashing and headbanging, and sometimes, like, so we wear, concert shirts and stuff like that. We let our hair down when we go in. You'd have guys who are like getting off of work and they're there with their briefcases in their business suits and they're part of the scene. And nobody's saying, like, look at that square over there. Whereas I think if you went dressed in a business suit to, I don't know, an Iron Maiden concert or a Wasp concert or something like that, you
Right.
get a lot of weird looks. People would be like, is this supposed to be like, the manager or the bouncer or, you
Right.
know? Um, so, that's it shows a kind of inclusiveness and we're here to do this thing. That's kind of cool as well. What else? So two other features that I wanted to bring up, and then if there's anything that you want to bring up, Scott, or anybody else wants to bring up, um, I think you can say that in the larger heavy metal world in the 1970s and 1980s, if you want to get airplay and traction, you got to sing in English. So, like you see the Scorpions and Accept specifically choosing to do that. There are some exceptions. Trust, Sortilège in France, but you might actually just attribute that to being French, because Belgian bands like Ostrogoth and Acid, they're French speakers. They sing in English.
Right.
So I don't know. There's a few bands that stayed kind of small because they did that. Japanese metal is like half and half, you know. A lot of it will be in Japanese, and it's sort of unashamedly so. And then, if they want it for the Westerners, they'll maybe make an English version. And you'll see this on albums too, where it's like half the songs are in Japanese, half of them are in English. So
Right.
that's an interesting feature. Is there anything that you wanted to say about that, Scott? Or
Well, I mean, I think you're right. If you want to make it here, you got to sing you got to sing in English, and that's the thing about like Klaus is like you never understand what he's saying for his rants, right? But everybody just goes crazy, it's
yeah.
and I
Well, I
remember
love you, Milwaukee. There was this QFM used to have this whatever they call these things where they play it
bumpers.
before this, yeah, bumper. And it was Klaus Meine. He's like, this is Klaus Meine, the Scorpions. We love you, Milwaukee. Listen to QFM. Like, what the hell's he
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah, and but everybody would go crazy, but yeah, and then even on interviews, I don't know if you ever read interviews back in the day with him, but he would get frustrated. The interviewer would point out that he got frustrated because he would like try to use a word and he's like, "What's the?" And he would point at something. The guy would go, "That's a trash can," or
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
And so he knows English to a degree, but I think it's absolutely important that it's in English. We're just used to it being in
yeah.
English, because we're a lot of people want to know the lyrics. If it's about rebellion, people are in. But if you don't know what it is, sonically it
I
could be
mean, that's the thing. A lot of these, I mean, I don't know Japanese at all. I mean, I
no.
know a few phrases that everybody knows, like domo arigato, right?
Oh
Because
yeah,
of Mr. Roboto, um, or mushi mushi, or things like that. But I can't follow anything that's being said in these songs. And frankly, even as a French speaker, if I'm listening to Sortilège, I can't follow what they're saying in their French. It's very difficult, I think, with music to catch that, except for folk music, maybe. But you can listen to it, and they're very good at conveying emotion, a certain sort of feeling to things, and you can listen to it and really get a lot from it. Mark says, I think the half-half approach is smart. Verses, this is true. Verses are often in Japanese and then the chorus in English, so the hook is accessible. That makes the songs more approachable to a wider audience. And that's a strategic decision, right? So
absolutely.
that is pretty smart. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's going to be this development in certain circles of what isn't in the 70s or 80s until late 80s maybe, called visual K. And it's not just a metal thing, but it's like the whole look aspect, a very aesthetic thing with the dyed hair and costumes and you know it's kind of cool because it parallels glam in the Western stuff, and it also parallels what bands were doing who are a bit more theatrical in British, American, Canadian metal as well. And there's also Kiss, of course, in the background, touring around Japan. Um,
Yes.
Kiss kind of has a big influence on that. And this isn't just a metal thing. It's like a broad spectrum thing, but there's certain metal bands that are going to be part of that we're gonna talk about. Um, the other thing I'll mention too is that going back to like Western bands, they all said that when they toured in Japan, they were given like the proverbial red carpet treatment. So that made them want to go back. They're making money, they're getting a lot, they're having fun, they're being treated really well. And that's probably part of the culture as well, as opposed to showing up somewhere else and having people say, get the hell, get in the back,
Right.
you dirty,
Yeah,
musicians or something like that.
absolutely.
Ken says, bearing in mind the prevailing post-war culture in Japan, even in the 70s, I think metal in Japan partly developed as a strong counterculture for and by younger people. And yeah, I'd say that's true, but it was sort of like it's probably more tolerated as a counterculture than countercultures in Britain or America were, you know, even in the 80s, right? You have long hair, they'd call you a dirty hippie, and people
Yep.
sometimes would want to beat you up. It's not a so there's counterculture in the sense of like asserting yourself against the prevailing culture. And then there's counterculture in the sense that the prevailing culture is going to discriminate against you and beat the crap out of you. So in the West, we had both of those, right? In Japan, I think you have the one, but not the other. There isn't a huge social handicap unless you are doing like the crazy dyed hair or stuff like that. There isn't a huge cultural handicap or cost to pay by being a metal fan you
Uh,
know
I was going to point this out earlier as a cultural thing because you even kind of said it in one of your examples. Outside the line's very orderly, and there's uh, from what I know, there's much stricter social demands on how people act,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So, um, and I think that's the attraction of heavy metal that they could go in there and blow off steam, you
Yeah.
know, and that's why you like it becomes pandemonium. But I've even seen like non-metal bands that would normally like have a rowdy audience, but everybody's sitting down, right? And they don't make a sound during the song. And some people said that's really uncomfortable, Whereas like a metal band, I think from the get-go, it's like, okay, here I don't have to ask, like feel repressed and
Yeah.
go by these social guidelines. But we don't have that here. I mean, it was like in the 80s, like we said, it was, the teens against the parents was the theme here.
Yeah, and we kind of like when you go to a show, there would be like a bit of competition, like who can thrash the most,
Right.
who can headbang the longest. I mean, it wasn't like they were giving out prizes or anything for it. Right?
Right.
There was a sort of performativity to it, you know.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, I thought this from the beginning. The culture thing's a big thing. Did those bands early on evoke some kind of freedom in some of
Oh
those
yeah.
lives? Just by hearing it. Um, and I think you know to this day where like particularly virtuosic metal, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
it's still huge. You know, and but by the same token you kind of feel like you made it if you're in a metal band and you go over to Japan because you get the red carpet treatment because you know and I guess slightly off topic. My brothers went to Japan once where I when I didn't go, and he was at a club and he plays very little guitar. So they made him go up because he was, a Westerner, and
Yeah.
he did a hack job on a Metallica tune, and like the place went bananas, because it's a Western dude doing this a Metallica song, and they were trying to buy him drinks and like, giving him the red carpet treatment. He goes, I didn't even do anything, I'd be
Yeah,
get beat up
yeah.
if I did that here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Depending on where you are. I mean, especially Boston, right?
Yeah.
People would be like, get out of here, you poser, and
You're closer.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting. So, you've got this cultural matrix that is continuing to play a role in how heavy metal is appreciated and consumed. Um, so Mark has a question here. I'm not too familiar with the idea. Would you say metal underwent a degree of recuperation in both Japan and the West in the late 70s, early 80s, an underground phenomenon being incorporated into the media mainstream? I mean, it never became as dominant in the mainstream as heavy metal did in Britain and the US. But it certainly had a like a rise, and there were more bands. They were getting contracts, and there were more places to go see them. And the music evolves, and it evolves in tandem in the West and in Japan. You can say the same kind of when you're listening to these albums in the discography, going from the stuff that's there in the 70s to the early 80s and then the late 80s. I mean, if you take away the Japanese lyrics, a lot of these bands could have been Western bands, you know, and you'd be like, oh, well, that's the sort of thing that was happening in the LA scene around this time, you know. So let's talk about the 80s. There, you know, here in the US and in Britain, there's this massive, you know, whatever you want to call it, resurgence, um, diversification of heavy metal in the US and the UK, Canada, Germany, Scandinavia. It's also happening in Japan, and people are starting to use the term heavy metal specifically for this kind of music. And the sound, as you know, we've talked about before, is getting, you know, heavier and harder, more distorted. And actually, Scott, so I mean, a lot of you've talked in the past about how a lot of this is what the technology makes available. And so, pure speculation here, but the Japanese bands would have had basically the same tech as American or British bands, right?
You
Maybe
know,
even
that's,
better in some respects, depending on what company it's coming from.
you know, I that's something I should have checked out what the Japanese bands were using. I didn't know if, I mean, Marshall was the thing with metal bands. Like most
Yeah.
people had Marshalls in this time, you know.
Were
And
distortion pedals coming out of Japan at all? I mean, so much electronics is manufactured over there by this time.
I mean, we could afford to make stuff here then, but like, you know, early on,
Yeah.
it's really just a fuzz pedal, you know, like
Okay.
the fuzz effect. And but the gain was gotten by cranking the amp to push the tubes into, you know,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
press. And I think as time went on, people wanted like the JCM 800 was a model that came out in the 80s and from Marshall. And they had one version where it was pretty much like the one before, and then about 85 they added it to, you know, be even more gainy and more distorted. So I don't know, maybe the technology was there, but you know, now you can do that classic thing, you can get
Yeah.
those, you know, there's now amps with a million bells and whistles that I don't even want to try to use, you know, but
Yeah.
they actually worked differently. And you can kind of hear, like when we talked about Priest, like the earlier stuff, the guitars weren't that distorted. They were heavy because of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
bass. And then later on, you know, there'd be much more distortion, or, you know, it's kind of,
Yeah, it
it's,
kind of hits its peak with Defenders of the Faith and Screaming for Vengeance, I would say. And so we're talking early 80s, you know.
yes. Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
good time with, I like the sound of late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
Because people were, you know, they didn't have a lot, there weren't a lot of pedals. You know, there was a chorus, there was a few, there was like a phase, there was a few things that, you know, people had and could get, and like there was like one or two companies that made them. But you know, now it's like everybody and their brother makes a
Yeah.
boot pedal.
Yeah.
So
So let's talk about what was happening first with Western bands, and then we'll get right into Japanese ones. So, you know, more touring, you know, as the you could say the Western boat is rising, the Japanese boat is rising too. Black Sabbath makes it to Japan with Dio. Iron Maiden famously tours in Japan early on and produces Made in Japan, which is hard to get your hands on these days, interestingly. Motorhead gets over there. The Scorpions tour again. Judas Priest tours again. And we start seeing, like, you know, bands like Saxon and Girls School who are, you know, they've got a little less money to do these sorts of things, but they're getting to Japan, and it's a great place for them to go. Ozzy Osbourne tours there. Wasp, believe it or not, early on in their time tours there in the 80s, and then Quiet Riot. And Quiet Riot deserves a little bit of extra talking about. Quiet Riot had had some albums that were only released in Japan, Quiet Riot 1 and Quiet Riot 2. And it's kind of good. Having heard them, they're not really great. Um, so you're kind of happy that they only did, but they thought this was a really big problem for them. And then there's these like big rock festivals going on. So Super Rock in '84 has Bon Jovi, Whitesnake, the Scorpions, Michael Schenkner Group, and Anvil. You know, they bring these bands over and they're being consumed, right? Super Rock '85 Tokyo had a little bit more diverse group. Dio was there, but then you've also got Foreigner and Sting.
That
Right? Sting is not really, I mean, Foreigner, you could say they're kind of heavy at least.
yeah.
Sting, I don't know about that. But there's also Rough Cut, which is an LA band managed by the Dios, and Earthshaker, which is a Japanese metal band. There are all these interesting like confluences. If you were going to tour around Japan, very often you'd tour with a Japanese band. And so you get this coming together. And then, you know, here's another sign of the times. 1981, there's the first supergroup put together called Heavy Metal Army. So you can't get any more self-consciously metal than that, right? Calling yourself Heavy Metal Army. And they put out one album, and it is a supergroup. It's got people from Mariner, Murasaki, Condition Green. It's even got a guy from Bow Wow as a guest. And they released an album which is called Heavy Metal Army 1 in 1981. So clearly they plan to do more. And, you know, what happens with supergroups? They rarely work out, you know, because you got
Mm.
egos and different schedules and they're successful people. And you start getting these development of these actual metal scenes. And so it's often talked about as the Kansai scene centered around Osaka and the west of Japan. And this is like back in the 70s and then into the early 80s. More bluesy, melodic, more straightforward metal. And then the Kanto scene is sort of like anything goes. And that's centered around Tokyo. You get the bands that are into the makeup and aesthetic stuff, and they're a bit more weird and proggy and doing some cool things. And by 1985, there's a record that gets put out by Kaosin Agency, and so they decided to showcase five completely unknown bands divided between the two regions, and they called it Kanto versus Kansai. So there's a self-consciousness of there's different kinds of metal happening, and none of these bands made it. Each of them got two songs. Apparently, they're good stuff. I haven't succeeded in getting my hands on an available soundtrack of it, but the reviews of them are really quite good. But you know, it kind of shows you too. There's like bands that make it up and manage to make a living, and then there's bands that don't. Very much like what happened with the new wave of British heavy metal, right? Or so many American scenes. So the most familiar band, I think, to everybody, Loudness.
Yeah.
This is a band that we actually heard over here in the United States, even in the boonies where I lived, because they made it onto MTV. And this band Lazy breaks up in 1980. And some of the members of Lazy, they want to do a more heavy thing. And they go with a new bass player, a new singer, and their first album is The Birthday Eve. It's very successful. It's very good. It's on the discography. You should listen to it. And then they're very consistent in bringing out albums. And I think this is something important too. And I'd be interested to get your take on this, Scott. So if we think about so we talked about Judas Priest, right? If you look at Judas Priest from Rock-a-Rolla basically to Turbo,
Mm.
it's almost an album a year, you know, and that includes it during a tour as well. So very productive, builds your catalog. That's the way that Loudness is. They have Devil Soldier in '82, Law of Devil's Land '83, Disillusion '84, and then they begin to do both Japanese and English versions. And then the album that they're probably best known for, Thunder in the East, in 85. And they tour the US, they tour Europe. In 85, they managed to snag a new manager from Twisted Sister. They get an international record deal, which was the first for a Japanese band. They record Thunder in the East in the United States, and they get they get a single, Crazy Nights, which is charting and getting some, yeah, 85. Think about how massively important MTV was in 1985, getting your
Yes.
video on there. um, so that's one really important band. And you know, and I'm curious, do you think that having so let's take another band by contrast that whose output is good, but um, didn't sort of match what, let's say, Judas Priest was doing or Iron Maiden was doing. Think about Rat. I love Rat. I wish that they'd recorded twice as many albums as they did. In the early days, they're pretty consistent, and then it's sort of like it spreads out longer and longer and longer in between each album. Um, do you think that's a detriment to their success?
You mean the leaving time in between albums?
Yeah, like significant gaps. I mean, some of these Japanese bands are also like Loudness, where it's just like album after album after album. And you know, if it's an album that sucks after another album that sucks,
Well,
that's not
that
going to
yeah.
help you, right? But if you got good albums, one after the other, and there we could use Judas Priest as an example. You know, think about it like Sin After Sin, immediately followed up with Stained Class, you know, and all the way to Defenders of the Faith. Turbo might have been a misstep. There's a lot of controversy about that, but it's clear. And some people are like, you know, Point of Entry. Oh, that's a weak album. I think that's just as good as the other ones. So you got like this nice, how many album streak? Like 7 album streak in there, you
And
know?
that's hard to do. I mean,
Yeah.
I know bands that, you're under contractual agreement,
Oh, true. Yeah. Yeah.
and that's why sometimes you get a live album out of nowhere because, and then you might get 2 bonus tracks from the live album because, well, putting out a live album is part of the deal. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if the frequency thing with Rat, I mean, I, s- what tour did I see them on? It was late, God, Brittany Fox opened. It was late 87 maybe.
Okay.
Invasion of Your Privacy. What's the album that came after that?
Um, it's not Reach for the Sky. That's later.
That
Dancing on, not Dancing Undercover. There was another one in between, right?
Yeah, I think was Reach for
Or
the Sky with the Statue of Liberty on the front, right?
yeah. Yeah.
That's the tour I saw.
Okay.
And it was sold out. But like I think even then it wasn't every year. I think it was starting to spread out then, right? For them.
Yeah.
And then I just think with Rat, when the 90s came, a lot of those metal bands just fell off, you know, because it went into grunge. That was like, and
Yeah.
MTV started their
That's
new
true. Yeah.
brand of music. And that's why
Yeah.
so many bands were getting signed in 1990 that were still metal or, whatever, pop metal. And, they'd have something and then, within 6 months they're done because that brand of music isn't on MTV
Yeah.
anymore. But like for some bands to do album after album and they're consistently good, I mean, if they couldn't do that, I'd rather them wait a couple of years. I mean, a lot of them write on the road. They, will write tunes together on the road if,
That's right. Yeah.
partying too much. But
Well, and
yeah,
in the 80s, that was a real issue, right? Especially you look at the musicians that have made it and are still doing, like, you know, bringing out an album every couple of years. They're all, you know, in their 60s and 70s, and they're like, yeah, we haven't partied for 20 years. We did a lot back then, and holy shit, we're glad we actually survived. But you can't do that sort of thing and still be productive anymore, you know?
yeah, I think a lot of these bands had babysitters too, like so to
Oh,
speak.
interesting.
They had, well, I know like Ace Frehley was
Wow.
He had somebody when
That
he
makes sense with him. Yeah.
yeah, when he rejoined Kiss, there was somebody with him to make sure that he was going to show up on time and not get too drunk. And even that didn't work, I guess. But they always had the
Yeah.
person on the road going, you got to get up now. It's lobby call at 6 a.m., and then everybody gets on with the hangover or whatever. And um, yeah, there was always a person paid for the label interest to recoup their investment. Um, but them being young, I don't know how it depends on the band, but who's going to write, or if they have a simple idea, if the producer is going to put it together. That
Yeah.
totally varies with every band.
Yeah.
Sometimes I hear, well, what's the one I was listening to that you sent me initially, the Japanese band?
Oh, I don't know. I've lost track of which
Plus, yeah.
recommendations I made. I mean, there were a couple in there that were kind of stinkers. Actually, let's talk about one of them. So, another one of the bands that we were gonna bring up, which is okay but not great, 44 Magnum. They're
Mm.
they're they're viewed as influential. I like their stuff. Scott was not as much of a fan. But with you, it was more technical stuff. Like the production could have been better. The
Well, I
guitars
think,
aren't really that interesting.
well, I thought the riffs were cool, but they were lacking arrangement and the songs
Okay.
weren't done yet. There was no element of surprise. Like they'd have the riff and I'd be like, oh, this is a good riff. This
Yeah.
is a good verse. And then it would just repeat that over and over. And I'm like, well, this is probably why they didn't make it. This sounds like a good collection of demos to start arranging.
Yeah.
Um, so it's hard to, the song should be over by now. And it's almost like they went and recorded without a good producer. And I thought that band would have had great potential.
That's an interesting point. So, and we haven't talked about this ever really. Very often people think about a producer as somebody who does like post-production in
Oh,
music, right? But at least in some bands, having somebody with a strong hand to rein in certain tendencies and say, no, 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 that's one verse too many. This has to be playable on the radio or something like that can be quite important. Now, you think about Martin Birch. Martin Birch did not make Iron Maiden radio friendly, but they say, wow, it was great to work with him. Um, so
yeah,
maybe that was an issue with some of these bands.
but so the role of producer, and a lot of people also think that the producer is the one, at the, actually doing the recording,
Yeah,
but that's the engineer. The
right,
producer
right.
generally is, if you're a metal band, um, you bring ideas, and the producer um will make suggestions about an arrangement. Like you need another section here, or I need a surprise here, or we're going to put a key change here, you know,
Mhm.
and then they oversee the performance. So they'll record like the basics, and they'll go, the bass and drums aren't really hanging in. Um, and it's their job to like make sure this songs, and it doesn't have to be short. They always had radio versions, but um,
Yeah,
it's kind of like a good producer will really arrange the music, cut this part out, or you need a bridge here, and then sometimes they will write it, or sometimes they'll just, insist the band write it until the producer is happy. Producers have different roles depending on the thing that you're,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
the thing that you're part of. But yeah,
Ken agrees with you on this. 44 Magnum had masses of enthusiasm, but composition and production weren't up to par with peer bands. I think that's important right there. Peer bands, which I think eventually led to their demise. So they're part of a scene. And we can say, we could draw contrast to bands in American or British metal scenes where you're like, yeah, they're fun to listen to, but they're definitely not as good as these other guys that are around them.
yeah, well, that's very true. And um and you'd be surprised, a lot of people, oh, people don't know the difference. The average person, first of all, people underestimate the average person. The average
Yeah,
person
yeah.
might not be able to articulate it the way a musician would, but they know if it's interesting to them or not, like a quick
Yeah.
surprise here or something there that kind of goose the song a little bit to, add some excitement. So I think, if you don't have the songs and the songs kind of drag on, people tend not to listen to it. Where in
Yeah.
with Maiden, they would have long songs, but there'd be these interesting
Well,
sections that would pop
yeah.
up.
I
And
was just listening to the other day as I was taking a walk, Iron Maiden, the debut album.
oh,
And I mean, every time that I listen to that, or I listen to most classic Judas Priest stuff, or you could pick a Scorpions from Fly to the Rainbow onward. You're like, holy shit, was this good?
yeah,
I mean, all the things that are happening just the right way, and you forget about that sometimes, especially when you're listening to a lot of other stuff and later stuff. But
yeah,
there's a staying power to certain compositions that certain bands have put out that are people are going to still be listening to them 100 years from now. Whereas, is anybody going to be listening to Motley Crue's Girls, 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 or Dr. Feelgood 100 years from now? I don't think so. I mean, they're popular songs. You hear them in bars or people play them, in other venues, but, they're fun, but they ain't
right.
great,
Yeah,
you know?
I think those songs are more. I think there's a word for this in film where you like do something, you put something into it that is a sign of the times, but
Yeah, yeah.
you won't last. It's kind of like, if there's a cool term that the kids are using, you throw that in the movie, but that will be old in about a year. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's a good example.
that's
So
it's like,
let's
yeah,
so let's talk about some more of these bands. So
yeah,
another one that's really interesting is Bow Wow. They've got like consistent album production. They tour overseas, and their early stuff isn't metal really. It's hard rock with some other softer stuff in there. And then they decide that they're going to play a more heavy metal kind of it just approach, and they change their name to signify this to Vow Wow, which is
yep,
what you find them listed under. And they bring in some new members, and then we get Beat of Metal Motion again, clear reference to heavy metal, and that's a heavy metal album, and it's quite good. And they put out a number of albums consistently. We have Earthshaker as well, who I like quite a bit, particularly their debut album, Earthshaker. There you can tell there's some like incorporation of new wave of British heavy metal acts. They actually have a song that's written by Adrian Smith, but they start losing it. And this is again a struggle that I think a lot of Western bands went through too. Should we like stick with the heavy metal stuff or try to reach a wider audience by going more AOR? Think about Rainbow as a prime example, right? I mean, I like Street of Dreams, but it doesn't compare to the Dio era Rainbow, you know?
right. I
So go ahead.
I think Rainbow is they're one of the bands that did it successfully because with Joel and Turner, it was more AOR, but it still rocked and it was still world
Mhm.
class kind of band. And yeah, there
And you
you're
still
right.
got Richie Blackmore on guitar.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, you would consider them a different band. Like I would have changed the name from Rainbow to something else
Yeah.
almost. But you're right. They're really different.
Yeah. So now three bands that are doing really interesting stuff in the 80s and even to some degree beyond. There's one called Sabra Bells. They only had a few albums because they get together in 82, they break up in 87. And if you listen to them, it's really heavy stuff and
Hmm.
really fun to listen to. They often get likened to Merciful Fate. Um, they're interested in the occult, and so they're kind of a good lead in to talking about one of the wilder bands, which is Seikima 2. And Seikima 2 means holy devouring demon. And here, when we're talking about the visual aspect, the visual K stuff, These guys are formed in 1982 by the guitarist Damien Hamada, and it includes a guy who's known as His Excellency Demon Kaka or Demon Koguri on vocals, Zad Hoshima on bass, and Ace Shimizu on drums. And a lot of those guys are going to go in and out. And Damien Hamada leaves the band soon after its formation, but he's viewed as the founder and he remains a songwriter. Sort of like I'm blanking on his name. He's got kind of a Dutchy name. The guy from Metal Church, who was there for the first album or so, and then remained part of the band's process, but didn't play with them anymore. Now this band is wild. They wear makeup. If you think that Kiss, is kind of crazy looking, you got to check these guys out. They've got all sorts of cool outfits, and there's like an entire lore around them. So a concert is referred to as a black mass. An album is referred to as a scripture of doctrine. A single is a chapter of doctrine. And they start playing gigs, and people, when you got a band like this, people are either they're like, this stuff sucks, or this stuff is amazing. What the hell's going on here? Right. And so, think about like when Alice Cooper was doing his early stuff, right? Or, Kiss comes out or Wasp comes out or bands like that. And this is, sort of like authentically Japanese. He's tying in not to a Western occult, but a Japanese occult. They start playing small gigs and people love them. And then they have a audition for CBS Sony. They release their first album, which is one I suggest. Akuma ga Kirate Heavy Metal. That's the name of the album. And there's a heavy metal magazine in Japan at the time called Burn, spelled with two R's, and they say this album sucks. This is garbage. They give it a 0 rating, right? So usually it's you kind of a 1 is the lowest. This is a 1 or a 0.
0,
but
yeah.
But the album sells. And again, you could say this is the case with so many other. I think about Black Sabbath and Kiss and bands like that. The critics hated these bands, right?
Oh yeah.
But this catches on. And so they released their second album, End of the Century, which is also really solid, and their first single, and they make it onto this Oricon albums chart. And we should have mentioned this a little bit earlier. We've got all these charts in Britain and America. So the Oricon chart is important in Japan. If you make it in there, you've like made something. And they have a compilation album, Worst, and this is 1989, that makes them the first Japanese metal band to reach #1 in that chart. So that's like a sign that this band is really getting there. Mark says Seiki Matu is awesome. They do spectacle really well. Yeah, this is a band where you can listen to the album, but you almost really would want to watch a live performance, wouldn't you?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
The visual is a part of the experience.
Yeah. So, and I think we could say that with some Western bands as well. It's great to listen to them, but whether it's something that's a film like Operation Mindcrime for Queensryche, or who
King
would be?
Diamond's a great example.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Like he'll have the themes, he'll have the stage set up, and it's yeah, that definitely, Abigail, I've never seen him, but my brother did and some friends did, and they loved it. I mean, that's an experience when you buy the ticket. I mean, it's
Yeah.
always an experience, but there's a little bit more there. There's storytelling a bit, but he's just King Diamond, the man.
Yeah. And so that's, you build up like an entire mystique, let's call it, around
Yes.
the band, and people respond to that. Another one that I really liked, and I'd be curious because I think you listened to them as well. There's a band that changes its name about halfway through their time, originally called Flatbacker, and they're formed in 1982 out of some high school bands. And you listen to that early stuff, and it is really heavy. So Um, they bring out their first demo albums and then a full length album called Accident, and it's it's the mid '80s, so you expect heavy metal to be heavy by that time, and guitars to be fast and all sorts of cool stuff to be happening, and they don't disappoint. They bring out another one, Issa, in '86, and then they change their name. And interestingly, they moved to the US and they shifted to a more commercial sound. They get Gene Simmons to produce the album Ezo on Geffen Records, so it's kind of a sign that you've made it
Yeah.
internationally. And Fire Fire it's a great album. Unfortunately, it comes out maybe a little bit too late. It's when there's too many glam bands and glam is starting to die. And so they just banned it. They just, like so many bands, financial setbacks lead to, people not getting along and they break up. But they were a good heavy band. And then we should mention as well, Shoya, this all-female heavy metal band. And their early stuff is pretty heavy. There's always, I mean, I have to say, having listened to their stuff, there's a few Lita Ford moments in there, we'll call them, where the music suddenly gets softer and there's like, there's a keyboard in the background, but it's not like an heavy organ keyboard. It's more the tinkly kind of piano-y kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
Um, and I'm not sure what that's about, but they're a funny band because they're formed to play together in a East-West Grand Prix musical contest. They changed their name from Medusa to Shoya. They win the contest for best female group, and that gets them a record contract with Toshiba EMI.
Mm.
And their album gets promoted by the Coca-Cola company. And they do a single, which is famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it. Are they a sellout or are they is this like, taking the money and running? Which is called Coke is It. And it's used in a TV and radio campaign, but they put out a bunch of albums. So Masquerade Show in '85, Queendom in '86, Ways '86, Trade Last '87, another one in '87 called Immigration, Glamour in '88, and Outer Limits, which is considered to be their best album in '89. And that reached number 3 in the Japanese charts. Became a really good selling album, went double platinum eventually, which is, kind of cool. And, their stuff is good. They're not as heavy as some of the other bands, but it's kind of neat to see an all-female band doing well. I mean, there's lots of them now, right? But this is,
There's more now. Yeah, but this is an era where it's, well, at least here, well, especially in Japan, I would think that
yeah.
women didn't do this kind of thing because it was aggressive or it was more things that men did, like even by, their parents. I had students back where, the parents hated that they were taking guitar lessons.
Oh, interesting.
It's just, and now, there's a lot of, it's just, but, it started with the Runaways and then kind
And
of
then
jumped.
Girl School, Girl School
Yeah.
are really central to that too. And
Yes.
I mean, the Runaways and Girl School, they weren't like, you need to make exceptions for us because we're women. It was more,
Yeah.
listen to us because we're actually just as good,
Yeah.
if not better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Andrew says a good segue into Visual K, which is great. I can listen to Priest or Faith no more audibly without caring what the visual aesthetic is, but with Visual K, it's about the overall aesthetic. I've heard so many bands say it's about the music, man, but without it, with visual stuff, it's about everything. Like X Japan, Bucktick, I would say that the visual aspect of these bands is, if not more important than the music. And now this is interesting. I wonder if this influenced bands like Avenged Sevenfold when they pretended to be vampires, or that Swedish band Serenity. And then talks a little bit more about a holistic aesthetic. Amon Amarth, for example, have Viking fights and a big ass boat and stuff like that. And now this would be a good one for Scott, but also for anybody else. I certainly feel bands are leaning more towards theatrical live shows today. So on the one hand, that costs money to do. right? And you've got to transport stuff from tour site to tour site. But on the other hand, in a market where touring merchandise is really where bands are making money, it's not on, streaming or anything like that. Is that a really good draw, you know, to
Yeah,
like
I
set
mean,
you apart?
well, yeah, well, I think because there's really no middle class in music now, in
Okay.
the business. There's the huge like Metallica
Yeah.
and um and the rest of the people are kind of like, anybody can get on streaming, anybody,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's no test for it. So I think bands have to get smarter now. It's, we call it like transmedia, where it's
Mm,
like the Beatles were the first to do it, right? They had their lunchbox, they had the movies that they made,
yeah.
you know.
So, but with the stage presence, right? Going to a show then becomes something more like you've got the,
Experience.
yeah, yeah. And I guess you could say there's a couple aspects to there. So there's the visual aspect, what's happening on stage, but then there's how do you participate as an audience member? Are you a more or less passive consumer, um, sitting back, holding up a lighter, throwing the horns, cheering, stuff like that? Or are you in some way like imagining yourself being involved in this spectacle?
um I think, oh, what's the one? Okay, a great example is KMFDM.
Okay.
So they have their characters. What's the big stone dude that, like, hits the drum, and and these become
Yeah,
characters
yeah.
themselves that
Guar would be another
you are
example like that. Yeah,
perfect
yeah.
example.
Yeah.
And then that's killer for merchandising because, you know, um, I want a t-shirt with that cool like stone figure, whatever, or the robot from Queen, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, if you made a t-shirt of that, I'd buy it, kind of thing. So it's kind of inventing a world you're inviting people into, and it doesn't mean the music's bad or good. It's separate from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of bands that don't have to do that sort of thing, and they can just get up on stage because they've built like a huge repertoire and legacy, and they've already got a style, the heavy metal style. Think about Saxon, right?
Yeah.
A Saxon show, you're going to get a great performance. They're still touring around now, and Biff Byford, I think, is in his 70s. Some of the other members are as well, but he jumps around on stage and delivers on the songs that people want to hear. And something we've talked about before, they play stuff from their recent albums, not just the most recent album, but they'll go back, like through the
Yeah.
whole thing. Topic we talked about a while ago. Um, but maybe some of the bands, if you do have a shtick, why not use it? So if you can't have Vikings fighting on stage, why not do that? Or Ken brings up Ramstein as an example of a band that
Oh yeah.
does highly produced stuff. Yeah, you don't have a Judas Priest show without Rob Halford driving the Harley out on stage
Right.
at some point. And you do have like, very often you'll have the background stuff. So Green Manalishi comes on, there's a big screen, and you've got the sort of character thing, same sort of motif as the Defenders of the Faith thing, except it's green and it's got the horns.
Mhm.
That's kind of halfway in between. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea. Well, we'll come back to that in just a bit. So moving on, a few other bands to talk about. There's Action, and we mentioned them before. And they're more hard rock or bluesy, but they can be pretty hard and heavy. I really like the title of their first album, Hot Rocks spelled with an X. I mean, you can't get any more 80s, sort of like sleazy metal than
Right.
that, right? And it's pretty straightforward heavy metal. They have a good album, Heart Razor, after that, and then they just put out a bunch of other ones that they're all pretty good, they're worth listening to. There's another band called United, which forms in 81. And they're definitely an homage to Judas Priest because they're taking their name from that song. Originally, they were a Priest and Sabbath cover band. And so they're like making their
Oh,
bones doing that. And then they start writing their own material in 83. And they're kind of unusual because they start going in a thrash direction around the same time that thrash is becoming big in the United States. So they have an EP called Destroy Metal in 85, and then Beast Dominate in 86. And then they start going even further into other directions as well. And then, in the late 80s, we get Dead End, which I think is pretty good. Mid to late 80s, they they have some good singles. Then they have this album Ghost of Romance, which 1987, there's a lot of stuff going on in metal at the time. It sounds like something of its time, you know. There's Anthem, this band that's formed in Tokyo pretty early on. They don't bring forward a um, album until 85, and it's Anthem's Anthem, and that's good, straight ahead heavy metal, I'd say. And then they produce a bunch of things. So you see these consistent bands like each year bringing out something. And then we get X Japan. And this has already been referred to a little bit in some of the comments. So X Japan gets formed in 82 out of some other bands. And they don't really have a consistent lineup until about 85. And they start releasing some singles. I'll Kill You. The second one is Orgasm. And then they have their first album, Vanishing Vision, in 88. So we're talking about late 80s, really, in terms of influence. But they're a band that it's very much about the aesthetic. And so this is why they wind up being so influential. And I would describe it as like, you know, um, power speed metal originally, and then it becomes more symphonic. And by the time that they're like really going on, they've figured out that ballads are a way to go. We had a whole show a while back on power ballads.
Power
So these
Ballad.
guys are doing that. And I think the album with them would be like Blue Blood from 89, their second album. Um, Very influential, got a lot of good songs on it. But it's funny because what made them is in part their aesthetic. That's why they were so important. And I think we can say that with some American bands and some British bands. What would Kiss be early on without the makeup? Would they have ever gotten the traction that they got without that look that they had? Um,
Wonder. There was comic books were huge back then. That's what they were thinking. They
yeah.
made themselves cartoon characters.
Yeah, or even like Twisted Sister. I mean, Twisted Sister's got good, I won't say like the best metal, but good metal stuff.
Yeah.
But the aesthetic that they had was pretty important, you
Oh
know?
yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So those are some important bands. There's a couple others that we included, like Terra Rosa. I kind of like their stuff. That's a female fronted band. They're kind of, their early stuff in the mid to late 80s sounds kind of like old school Rainbow. Heavy organs, the organ and guitar trading off with each other. We also get this band Outrage, which is very clearly sort of influenced by a new wave of British heavy metal bands. And like a lot of these bands, it takes them years to actually bring out an album. I guess one of the things that we could say is, you know, if you've got experienced musicians, you can create a super group and start recording immediately, right? Or you can bring people in and within a year bring out an album. If you're a band that's, formed by pretty young musicians who don't really know what's going on, but just love music, it might take you years to kind of sort out who do I need to talk to? How do we get, recording space, all of those sorts of things. So we see a lot of bands forming and influenced by heavy metal acts in the early 80s who don't bear fruit until the late 80s in Japan.
Mm.
But we see that also again, to draw another parallel with a lot of bands in the United States and Britain and, Scandinavia and other places too, right? I mean, what do you think about that need to accumulate experience and not just experience like playing, but like figuring out how things work aspect?
That's important. It's the part of the paying your dues. Although I will say it's a good topic because, at least here in America, there were certain bands, like Warrant, or
Mm,
and they weren't so good in the studio. You know,
okay.
they were fine live, and um, they would call in session players like Steve Lukather to play, or even Red
Well,
Beach
that's
from
interesting.
and they would actually play the guitar. And then Robin Ford actually played on Creatures of the Night, the Kiss album. Um, and if the guitar player wasn't cutting it, and we don't have 6 months for you to get it right. You know,
Yeah.
they call someone in that'll like nail it first take.
And so then the player who's going to play with the live act and who's considered to be the band member basically has to learn the solos, the licks, the riffs that the other person did. That's got to be
Yeah,
kind of demoralizing,
I
isn't it?
mean,
Or
yeah, I mean, sometimes it's a surprise that they didn't know that they weren't on it. Sometimes
Hmm.
it's not that the player's not good, but playing in the studio is a very different thing than playing live. And
Yeah.
so the kind of precision you need that you like, you can get away with a few rough things live, no problem, but the studio is very unforgiving. So um, I think experience in the studio is different than experience playing live.
Yeah. And
You know,
then we can talk about like actually getting a record deal and some backing. Now, a few of these bands put out their own stuff, right? Independently, but most of these bands, they needed to like play in a battle of the bands and get noticed by somebody or, ideally you've got somebody like in the audience scouting at
well,
one of your live shows. Yeah.
that's what happened mostly, like in Boston, when Boston was the hot place. you know um People would know that somebody was coming out to check them out, and if it looked like they were getting the crowd going, or they had a crowd, and they
Yeah.
thought they could make money off of them, they would sign them. So there was people actually going out by the record companies to check bands out, and it was up to them whether they were going to sign them or not.
Yeah.
So
And that's got to have been happening then in Japan just as
what
much as it was in the States or the UK then.
I
At least
imagine,
at that time. I mean, now that's not really happening, right?
I you know
With live acts? Is
I
is
don't know.
anybody going around scouting from a record company or
I don't, not that I know of. I mean, you used to hear about it all the time, and this is before the internet. The band would know, and it would spread around Boston that somebody's going to be at a show, like from Geffen or something.
okay.
Um, no, I mean, today, even like the bands that are like kind of like perpetually on tour, they're broke, and but they're on tour, and they selling the merch and stuff, maybe only covers the gas, not the
Hmm.
hotel room, not the food. So
Yeah. So Andrew's got an interesting thing. I wonder about the reverse. A band like the Residents made studio albums that weren't designed for live performance. I think they played live at some point, though. Steely Dan is another band that avoided live performance from the 70s to the 90s. Maybe somebody can correct me on that. And I think there are a few metal bands. I'm trying to bring one to mind where they weren't really interested in touring, but they did put out albums. Um,
yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, Steely Dan is the best example I know of that.
yeah.
And I'm not sure why. I'm
I
not
mean, you
sure.
can certainly bring up like musicians who usually then left the band because they didn't want to tour around. You know, like an early Judas Priest, right? The first singer. That's why he left the band because he had a family and he was like, I'm not going on the
Oh,
road.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But with Steely Dan, it was, Fagan and Becker, and that's Steely Dan, and everybody else is a hired gun. So when they
Yeah.
were going on the road, I mean, they always get New York players, pretty
Okay.
much, because they're from New York. But yeah, it wasn't till the '90s somewhere that they actually. I mean, I think they did like TV appearances in the '70s, but I don't
Okay.
have any, live. So and I'm trying to think of a metal band like
Oh,
that.
so Ken says that's something that happens fairly frequently in the extreme metal scene when a band is in fact one
Ah,
musician.
that's a good point.
Yeah, and we could talk about that phenomenon over time as well, where a band is I mean, think Richie Blackmore's Rainbow is Richie Blackmore and whoever he happens to have not fired at this point in time, right? I mean, Motorhead to a certain degree is whoever Lemmy is gonna be working with. Now he has some people on for a long time, but
Right.
yeah. I mean, it's funny too, because like and I don't want to be too derogatory, but Ozzy Osbourne, he's a decent singer. That's all he does, you know. They really ought to call it the Sharon Osbourne show because she's great at surrounding him with great musicians who will
Yeah.
do all the work, all the writing, you know. Uh, Probably steal their credit like they did with Bob Daisley and Don Airey, and
And Jakey Lee.
yeah, and then throw aside, you know.
Yep.
Um, and that's not like, I mean, that's not like Lemmy, where Lemmy like knew the business in and out, or like Dio, right? And they're like, I'm putting together a great band around me. And if that guy doesn't want to, do his job, he's out of here. We're bringing somebody in, right?
Yeah.
Ozzy's just kind of wandering aimlessly around and,
Yeah.
singing some stuff, and Sharon's behind the scenes doing everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's not her, it's other people, but Ozzy's not for a long time. I don't think he's really been part of anything, part of any
Yeah.
decisions.
So Mark says, and I don't know this band, one Japanese band I was interested in hearing your take on is Animetal, given
Mm.
the cultural significance of anime in Japan. I don't know if you came across them. For me, and I think this I share with others in my generation, a lot of my exposure to Japanese media was through anime.
Yep.
And this is sometimes what led me to discover some of these bands initially. Yeah, and I think this is a generational thing. I mean, there are people our age, minus Scott's age, who are interested in anime, but it's much more of a younger person thing. If you were into that sort of stuff when we were young, you were considered a weirdo, and not the cool kind of weirdo, like being into heavy metal, you know.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
um, but it's become huge. I mean, my students at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, lots of them are massively influenced by that. But I think that's a generational thing. And however people find their way into stuff, I think it's important. If it brings people to listening to classic heavy metal, great. I'll mention too, so like people sometimes pitch me that I should do when I'm talking about speculative fiction, there are anime series that I should focus on. And my answer is, well, I got limited time and I'm not really well versed in that. So I'm going to stick to the books over here that I know, and somebody else can do Berserk or whatever,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So apparently they've been around for a while, late 70s. So I didn't come across them, but they must have been around for quite some time.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't heard of them.
Yeah. But we should open up. We've talked a lot about a lot of things, but any other questions or things people want to bring up? We're getting close to almost 2 hours at this point, and I know Scott's got stuff to do, and so do I. Um, but any other things that people want to bring up about Japanese classic metal? Um, and keep in mind too, I don't have the level of expertise on this sort of thing that I could say that I at least possess when it comes to American or British or even German metal. It's more of a learning curve thing for me, you know.
Well, for this, yeah, I have to say, I learned a lot from this one. Um, just starting to be aware of like, a topic you don't think of. You're kind of aware of it, but
Yeah.
dig into it, and it's a world I'm certainly not an expert on. A lot of the bands I had never heard of.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to a lot more listening. It's very cool that, so I'll say this. We've got this amazing resource out there in YouTube. Like a lot of these bands, you can't find their stuff in iTunes.
Right.
But and maybe this is part of that collector culture thing, but not just as, strictly Japanese, but like metal collector culture. Thank God there's so many people who probably illegally recorded and uploaded entire albums to YouTube that we can listen to um, for free and anywhere we want to in the world. Almost all the bands that we've talked about, all the albums that we've talked about, you can find a full copy of it.
Yep.
You just gotta like sometimes do a little bit of searching and it's there.
Yeah.
And it's high quality too. It's not like the old days of YouTube where it was probably somebody with a camera focused
That's
on
right.
them playing it on a phonograph or something like that.
Yeah, right.
So Mark says, did you perhaps come across any of the more contemporary Japanese metal bands? Didn't research that at all because we're basically interested in the 70s and 80s, and it would have gotten totally out of um, what's the word? There would have been just too much stuff
Yeah.
because just as with you can say metal in the West, you've got this pretty wide swath of bands, but then from the 90s onward, it just widens out. There are like thousands and thousands of bands out there. Um, Now, are any of them making any money? That's a different question. You know?
Yeah.
But there's so many bands out there, and the Western notion of different genres filters into the Japanese scene as well. So there are Japanese death metal bands, there are Japanese doom bands, all these sorts of stuff. And I find it's easier to stick to the period of the 70s and 80s because it's more manageable, as it is classic metal class. So
Yeah.
Ken says that would be another interesting topic for a future episode, bands with organic cultural influences. Yeah, where they're coming from is making an impact on how they do metal, how they
Yeah.
understand metal. I like
Exactly.
that.
It's
Yeah, that's a
really
good
important.
idea. Well, why don't we wrap this up? Any last words, Scott, on your part
No,
before we thank
I
everybody?
learned, I definitely learned a lot. And, by researching some of this stuff with you, and, definitely a you thought of the topic, which was great, but, it's like, why didn't we think of this earlier? Because, but
And
metal,
there's other locations we got to talk about
yeah,
too. I mean, we've never talked about Canadian heavy metal,
no,
and there's a lot of
no,
bands.
right.
It ain't just Anvil.
Yeah,
So, all right.
yeah.
Well, thanks to everybody, and thanks for all your questions and comments, and we'll see you next time.
See everyone.